I'm going to talk a little bit about what the biospheres are doing. And if I don't know the answer, I'm sure I have people on the ground who can find the answer for you. And there's a wide range of activities and projects that we're involved in, SDGs, and well, everything is kind of framed within the SDGs, isn't it? Anyway, so my name is Kate Potter. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Biosphere Reserves Association. Thanks for the invite to come and chat today about our work. CBRA is the national organization that supports and promotes the work of Canada's 19 UNESCO biospheres. I should say biosphere reserves. And that's a good point that I should point out here before I go on, that I use biospheres, biosphere reserves, and biosphere regions kind of interchangeably. The official term is UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, and we'll talk about that in a minute. In Canada, though, we have had conversations among the network to talk about maybe changing the word from reserve to region for a number of different reasons. The two I think that would probably have the most importance to this group include region kind of better reflects the whole of society regional approach that biosphere regions take. And there's also the word reserve has a negative history or context within talking about reconciliation. So moving away from the word reserve, but again, it's up to each individual biosphere to determine what they're using. Next slide, please. So biosphere regions are designated by UNESCO. UNESCO is an international body, and therefore there is an international or world network of biosphere regions. There's over 700 worldwide, and they all follow the same format. Next slide. So you can't just decide one day to become a biosphere region. It takes years of community development and community coming together around a common vision. But when that happens, they apply to UNESCO, and if they're successful, they receive the designation of UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. When they receive that designation, there's also a 10-year periodic review where they have to come back every 10 years to tell UNESCO how they're continuing to uphold the standards of the designation. That's a whole separate webinar. If you receive the designation of being a biosphere reserve, you are within the Man in the Biosphere program. And the Man in the Biosphere program is outlined or there's guidelines or ways in which you should be a biosphere that's outlined within the Lima Action Plan. They call it the roadmap. That'll go till 2025, and then there'll be a new one in place that will dictate kind of the changes over the last 10 years and what the new Man in the Biosphere program will look like. But it will follow under these four kind of themes. So the main themes and focus of biosphere regions are the conservation of biological and cultural diversity. There's logistical support, which is kind of running through all of them. That's research, monitoring, education, training, those kind of activities. Climate action, reconciliation. And then the last one is the economic development that's socially, culturally, and environmentally sustainable, or sustainable development. So really, biosphere regions are a global or international designation looking at global problems with a local solution, and they are framed within, or they have to be working towards, the implementation of the SDGs, but also the Convention on Biological Diversity, UNDRIP, and a number of other international conventions. Next slide, please. So in that Lima Action Plan, the roadmap of how to be a biosphere, it specifically says that biosphere reserves have a critical role in just within their mandate, their approach of what it means to be a biosphere, but also their connection to the region and the local communities. Next slide. So biosphere regions are internationally recognized as significant areas of biodiversity. They have community support towards an area or a region with a goal where the economy and the environment are not at odds, but complementary. Each biosphere region across the world, including Canada, is made up of the following zones. That is a combination of what's on the landscape already, but also the future vision of what the community would like. So the core area, that's the green in the middle, it's usually the highest area of biodiversity, usually a national or provincial park or some other form of protected area. The buffer zone is the darker blue. It supports the core work through monitoring, education, training, nature-based tourism, those kind of activities. And then the transition area, which is the lighter blue or the kind of gray color, and that's usually where the people live. So before we move on, there's 2 points here to note. Biosphere regions have no regulatory or legal authority in the areas that they are situated in. And the most important aspect of biosphere regions throughout all of the programming, throughout all of the documentation, is that connection of people and nature together, or the inclusion of people within nature. Next slide, please. And Maddie, you can just advance through these, but before we move into the Canadian context, I just wanted to highlight that because we're part of this worldwide network, UNESCO and others have put together resources. So there's examples. So these are just 3 under SDG 3, 7, and 12, but the whole suite of SDGs are there, and it's highlighting examples of biospheres working under these particular SDGs with videos and pictures and more detailed reports around kind of the projects that they're working on. So if we don't have a particular project under a specific SDG, we can go to the World Network to look at what others are doing. And this is just a small snapshot because there's over 700, like I mentioned. So there's just a small sampling of some of the SDG work that biosphere regions are doing across the globe. Next slide, please. So this is the Canadian National Network. So our oldest biosphere region in Canada is Mont-Saint-Hilaire in Quebec, formed in 1978. Our newest one is Qatsam House Sound in BC. Was just, I can't say last year anymore, in the fall of 2021. And we also have the only Indigenous-led biosphere region in the world in Sachwe, which is up in the north. And next slide, please. So the Canadians in biospheres, or how they're affected or connected. So if you look at the total population of Canada, we estimate that there's about 21 million Canadians that are within 50 kilometers of a biosphere, and about almost 3 million Canadians that are living within a biosphere. And these numbers are a few years old, so the numbers may be even higher now, but they also were hosted by 50 First Nations, as well as 100 municipalities. Next slide, please. So the reason why, the specific reasons about what makes Canada's BRS special is diverse as the network itself. Each biosphere region has its own reason of why they're special, why they're unique, why they're designated. But just a couple of ideas, and again, this could be another webinar on its own. But looking at, like, one of the biospheres is the most diversified agricultural economy in Canada. We have several globally significant important bird areas or migratory flyways and critical migration habitat. There's rare mixed prairie species that are found only in that particular area. And if you're familiar with the key biodiversity areas analysis that's going on right now, we have 17 out of 19 biospheres that have a key biodiversity area that's identified within them. No big surprise given what I've just talked about in terms of biodiversity and the focus or the reason why biospheres become biosphere regions. Next slide, please. So the biospheres are all the same because they're all within that same framework, and yet they're all different at the same time. And that could be based on organizational size and capacity of the nonprofits that support the designation, the age and history of the organization, the population and community needs of the region itself, and the context or the landscape in which the biosphere region is working in. For example, it could be a coastal biosphere in the Bay of Fundy to an agricultural biosphere within the prairies at Red Berry Lake, to a biosphere on the West Coast, which is, has everything from mountaintops down to the coastal waters. And that really influences how the biosphere region kind of operate and what their priorities are. Next slide, please. So I'll start that again. In an ideal world, all Canadian biospheres would have all of their work that's identified as it pertains to each of the SDGs. And a number of them do. I'm going to talk about them in a minute. But really, all the biospheres are working on all the SDGs, whether directly or indirectly. There's usually a focus, like I mentioned earlier, on SDG 11, 13, 14, and 15, as well as SDG 4. But each biosphere may take one of the other SDGs and focus or include that within their programming. But really, the mandate of biosphere regions as a whole has them working on all of these SDGs. And I'm going to talk about a report in a minute that was produced by the Fundy Biosphere, but there's a great statement in there that says there's really no right way for a biosphere region to engage with the SDGs. How a biosphere chooses to interact or focus on an SDG or grouping of SDGs will really depend on their size, research, capabilities, values, priorities, and needs of the community that they operate within. Next slide, please. So this is a great diagram. It wasn't produced by the Fundy report, but I did snag it from them. I borrowed from them. So most of the biosphere regions in Canada are specifically working on that kind of bottom layer. And then as the capacity and age of the organization increases, so do the complexity of the work, and they kind of move up the different levels of donuts there. Next slide, please. So this is our first example of an SDG project that's happening within Canada. So keeping in mind that all the biosphere regions are working on SDGs. These ones have a specific SDG focus. And so Maddie, I'm going to talk about each of the different components of these wheels. So as I change, if you could just advance through, that'd be helpful. Thanks. So starting with conservation. So the report looks at what SDGs are, how biosphere regions can implement the SDGs, but also how the Fundy biosphere itself can implement the SDGs. So under conservation, biosphere regions can provide awareness to the local community about environmental issues. They can increase awareness about, for example, biodiversity loss. They can support government policies that conserve valuable ecosystems. They become role models and educators, stewards of the environment through habitat restoration, other biodiversity practices, and they can empower and engage with youth to kind of foster that conservation ethic moving forward into the future years. Next slide, please. Economic development. So biospheres can help implement the SDGs by ensuring that all the events that are held are accessible to all, promoting economic growth by supporting youth employment, entrepreneurship, sustainable tourism, local economies. They can assist and promote the marginalized communities living within their region, and they can ensure that the economic benefits of development that's happening have a benefit to the entire community. For education, they can encourage and promote the SDGs as topics of research and education within the region. They can support incubation or around innovation for sustainable development solutions. And they can help to implement SDG solutions. For climate action, all of the themes, biospheres can help to support and apply for funding to implement some of these projects, not only for themselves, but for the region or other partners. But for climate action, they're focusing on nature-based solutions, supporting local legislation to help mitigate the effects of climate change, and trying to find and understand and communicate those local stressors and contributors to climate change. Under reconciliation, that's really looking at kind of internally as an organization for biospheres, but they can focus on what they can learn about the Indigenous peoples, how they can support, build build relationships, demonstrate respect, and renew the commitment to reconciliation, and kind of help support the needs of the Indigenous nations that are hosting the biospheres. And then lastly, the organizational governance. Biospheres can include their governance and operational policies that are in line with SDGs. They can facilitate some cross-sectoral dialogue within the community, which we'll hear about in a minute. And they can demonstrate their own commitment to the SDGs and communicate that to the community. And next slide, please. So the next project is from the Clayoquot Sound Biosphere Trust, which is a biosphere reserve, but again, not using the word reserve in its name. So the image on the left is the image of the front cover of a document that they put together, identifying 5 different ways in which they are working on the SDGs. So the first image on the upper right is the vital signs reporting. So that's looking at SDG 10 and looking at economic trends within the community that were contributing to wealth inequity. And kind of parallel or complementary to that is the image on the bottom right. And all of these reports are available on the Clayoquot Sound Biosphere website. The image on the bottom right is the living wage calculation. So that's looking at what a family of 4 would need to make to have a very bare bones budget to be able to survive and live within the Clayoquot Sound area. Again, looking at SDG 10 and trying to reduce inequalities. Next slide, please. And this page, again, this is so the third way that they identified how they can work with SDGs is the vital conversation. So that's the like cross-sectoral community dialogue around different topics, but with an SDG lens. So they call it vital conversations, and they've had conversations around sustainable tourism, empowering youth, and other topics, but considering them within the SDG lens. Pathway 4 was education. So they were looking at kind of bringing everyone together, multiple levels of government, to come together for a common vision around sustainability. And they use the SDGs as kind of a platform or a way in which to discuss that. But they've also identified programs. So they have a program called the West Coast Nest, which is, they call it academic tourism. So it's people coming to the area to learn, and you know, Clayoquot Sound is a huge tourist draw for a lot of people that want to be doing nature-based tourism. And they have courses in which these tourists, both locals and tourists, can take to learn about different aspects of the region. And one of them, or a number of them, I should say, is around the SDGs. And then the last pathway, there's no image there, but it's around looking at ways that they can invest in the community to take the community or divest the community away from fossil fuel dependencies. And those are conversations that are happening across the community. So the next project example, the third one, is looking at, this is from Akatsum House Sound, which is the newest biosphere. And because they're a new biosphere, you know, there are changes around, or depending on when you've become a biosphere. And because they become a biosphere when they did, they had to identify kind of their work plan as it responds to the SDGs in a more kind of direct and clear way. And so they have on their website, they have all the SDGs, they have what the SDG is, what the Canadian response is, and what the actions that are happening within their biosphere as it responds to each of the different SDG icons. And they're using that as a way to promote to the community, both, yes, we're a new biosphere region and we've just become designated, but also this is the SDG and our work and how they're related. And then the last example, last but not least, is Mount Arrowsmith. So that's in BC as well. They hosted a Getting to Know the SDGs forum. So they brought municipalities from across the region together to talk about SDGs, why they're important, how they can be implemented within their local municipal planning, but also the bigger kind of municipality and government framework in which they work in. So I'm going to close out my presentation just by saying with the next slide that there's more information. So there's one episode on every biosphere under the Striking Balance documentary series, which I highly recommend. There are more information on the website as well as my email, which is there. And we have a particularly good series of reconciliation papers and videos about how individual biosphere regions are undertaking reconciliation. And we also have a fantastic 2-minute national video, which I put in my introductory chat in the waterfall. And I think with that, I'll close it out and